The morning train to Colorado Territory wheezed to a halt at Millbrook Station, steam hissing from its iron belly like a dying breath. As the last passenger stepped down onto the weathered platform, one figure remained, a woman in ivory silk, clutching a carpetbag with white-knuckled determination. She had been waiting for 3 days, watching every sunrise paint the distant mountains gold, counting every sunset that stole another piece of her hope. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was about to discover that sometimes the greatest love. Stories begin with the deepest betrayals. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Whitmore stepped off the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive at precisely 11:43 in the morning, her traveling dress pristine despite the long journey from St. Louis. The conductor, a kindly man with silver whiskers, helped her down. The iron steps with careful hands, his eyes lingering on the wedding band already circling her finger, a thin gold ring she had worn in hopeful anticipation. "Your husband is meeting you here, miss?" he asked, though the title felt wrong given the ring. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice carrying the confidence of a woman who had never been given reason to doubt. "Mr. Theodore Blackwell. He owns the Mercantile." "Here." The conductor nodded and tipped his cap before climbing back aboard. Clara stood on the platform, her carpetbag at her feet, and surveyed her new home. Millbrook was smaller than she had imagined from Theodore's letters. A collection of wooden buildings scattered along a dusty main street, dwarfed by the towering peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the October sky. The air was thinner. Here, crisp with the promise of early snow, and carried scents she couldn't name, pine, sage, and something wild that made her pulse quicken. She had expected Theodore to be waiting. They had corresponded for 8 months, their courtship conducted through carefully penned letters that grew increasingly intimate as weeks passed. He had sent her a tintype photograph showing a handsome man with dark hair and serious eyes, standing beside what he claimed was his prosperous store. He had proposed through the mail in July, enclosing the ring and a heartfelt plea for her to join him in Colorado before winter set in. Clara had said yes without hesitation. At 26, she was considered by many in St. Louis society to be approaching spinsterhood. Her father had died 2 years prior, leaving debts that consumed most of the family estate. Her mother had remarried quickly. A practical union with a banker who made it clear that Clara's continued residence was temporary at best. Theodore's proposal had seemed like providence, offering both love and security in equal measure. Platform emptied as other passengers found their destinations or connections. Clara remained, adjusting her burgundy traveling hat and smoothing her skirts. Perhaps Theodore had been delayed by business matters. She could wait. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill. Clara opened her reticule and retrieved Theodore's last letter, reading again his promise to meet her train. The paper bore coffee stains from her nervous breakfast that morning, but his words remained clear. "My dearest Clara, I shall be waiting at the station when your train arrives, ready to begin our new life together." A man emerged from the depot office, a clerk with ink-stained fingers and an apologetic expression. "Ma'am, you waiting for someone in particular?" "Mr. Theodore Blackwell," Clara said. "He owns the Mercantile." The clerk's face went carefully. "Blank. Blackwell's Emporium, you mean?" "Yes, exactly. Well, ma'am—" The clerk removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. "Mr. Blackwell, he left town about a week ago, took the eastbound train with a considerable amount of luggage." Clara felt the platform seem to tilt beneath her feet. "Left town? But we're to be married. I have his ring." The clerk's eyes found the gold band on her finger, and something like pity flickered across his features. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to say, but Theodore Blackwell was already married, had been for 3 years. His wife and children live above the store with her sister now, trying to sort out the mess he left behind." The words hit Clara like physical blows. She gripped her carpetbag tighter, using its weight to anchor herself to reality. "There must be some mistake." "I wish there was, Ma'am. But Theodore, well, he had a way of making promises he couldn't keep. Word is, he left owing money all over town. His wife, Patricia, she's a good woman, been working herself near to death trying to make good on his debts." Clara's carefully constructed future crumbled like a house of cards in a high wind. The mercantile she had imagined helping to run, the comfortable rooms Theodore had described above the store, the life they had planned in careful detail through their letters, all of it had been built on lies. "Ma'am, you got people back east you can wire?" the clerk asked gently. Clara thought of her mother's new husband, of the packed trunks she had left behind, of the bridges she had burned in her eagerness to start fresh. "No," she said quietly. "No, I don't." She spent the first night in the depot's waiting room, curled on a hard wooden bench with her carpetbag as a pillow. The clerk, whose name was Ezra Finch, brought her coffee and a stale biscuit from his own dinner, but she could barely force herself to swallow. Outside, the wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of coming snow. Dawn came grey and cold. Clara woke stiff and disoriented, her traveling dress wrinkled beyond salvation. Ezra arrived early to open the depot and found her standing at the window, watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "Morning, Ma'am," he said carefully. "You sleep any?" "Some." Clara turned from the window, attempting to restore some dignity to her appearance. "Mr. Finch, is there any work to be had in town?" Ezra considered this, stroking his sparse beard. "Well, Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house sometimes needs help with laundry and such, and Doc Miller's been looking for someone to tend his office, keep his files in order. But neither pays much, and winter's coming hard this year." Clara nodded. She had perhaps $15 to her name, the last of her savings after purchasing her train ticket. "Could you direct me to Mrs. Patterson?" The boarding house was a 2-story structure of weathered wood, its paint peeling like old skin. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a stern woman with iron-gray hair and hands permanently stained. "From lye soap?" She looked Clara up and down with calculating eyes. "You're the one who got left by Theodore," she said without preamble. "Heard about it from Ezra. Shame, but not surprising. That man never met a truth he couldn't twist into something prettier." "I'm looking for work," Clara said, lifting her chin. "I'm willing to do whatever needs doing." Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Dressed like that? Honey, you look like you never washed a dish in your life. I assure you, I'm quite capable of—" "Room and board costs $8 a week," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "I can give you 3 wages for helping with cleaning and cooking. That leaves you 5 short, and I don't run a charity for fallen women." The words stung, but Clara swallowed her pride. "Perhaps I could find additional work elsewhere." "Maybe." "Doc Miller pays $1 a week for filing, but that's only a few hours' work. Mrs. Chen at the laundry might have something, but she's particular about who she hires." Clara spent the day walking Millbrook's dusty streets, learning the shape of her new prison. The town was larger than it had appeared from the depot. Perhaps 300 souls scattered among shops, homes and businesses that served both residents. And the steady stream of miners, ranchers and travelers passing through. She applied for work at every establishment, but found the same pattern repeated: curious stares, polite inquiries about her circumstances, and gentle refusals. Word traveled fast in a small town. Everyone knew about Theodore Blackwell's abandoned bride. By evening, she had secured only the filing position with Doc Miller and a promise from Mrs. Chen to consider her for laundry work if business picked up. Together, they would provide, perhaps, $2 a week, nowhere near enough for room and board. She spent the second night on the depot bench again, ignoring Ezra's awkward offers of help. Pride was about all she had left, and she wasn't ready to surrender it yet. The third morning brought the first snow of the season, fat, lazy flakes that melted as soon as they touched the ground, but promised heavier falls to come. Clara woke to find frost covering the depot windows like lace, her breath visible in the cold air. She had made a decision during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. She would take the next eastbound train back to St. Louis, no matter how humiliating the return might be. Her mother's new husband might be cold and unwelcoming, but sleeping on his floor was preferable to freezing in a Colorado depot. Ezra found her counting and recounting her remaining money when he arrived to open the office. "Train East comes through at 4 this afternoon," he said without being asked. "Ticket to St. Louis runs $12. Clara had $11.37. Could I perhaps work out the difference somehow?" Ezra's face was kind but firm. "Company rules, ma'am. Can't let anyone ride without full fare." Clara stared at the coins in her palm. 63 cents short of escape. It might as well have been $63. "Tell you what," Ezra said, clearly uncomfortable. "My wife, she does washing for some of the better families in town. Maybe she could use extra hands today, pay you enough to make up the difference." It was charity, but Clara was beyond caring about pride. She spent the morning hunched over washtubs behind the Finch house, her hands red and raw from lye soap, her back aching from bending over the steaming water. Mrs. Finch, a plump, motherly woman named Ruth, clucked sympathetically and pressed an extra quarter into Clara's hand when the work was done. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You're a good worker," Ruth said kindly. "Don't let what that man did define what you're worth." By 3 o'clock, Clara sat on the depot platform with her carpet bag beside her, watching the eastern horizon for the smoke that would herald her salvation. She wore her traveling dress again, the same ivory silk she had donned with such hope 3 days earlier. It was wrinkled and stained now, bearing the marks of her brief, brutal education in frontier realities. The snow was falling, heavier now, dusting the platform and muffling the sounds of the town. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried not to think about what waited for her in St. Louis. Her mother's disapproval, her stepfather's cold tolerance, the whispers of neighbors who would hear about Theodore's betrayal. She would find work, as a governess perhaps, or a companion to some wealthy widow. She would rebuild her life from the ashes of this mistake. 4 o'clock came and went. No train appeared on the eastern horizon. At 4:30, Ezra emerged from the depot office with a telegram in his hand and an apologetic expression on his face. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. Eastbound been delayed by snow in the passes. Won't be through until tomorrow afternoon, at the earliest, maybe longer if the weather gets worse." Clara stared at him, then at the telegram, then at the snow that was indeed falling harder now, beginning to accumulate on the platform and the surrounding buildings. One more night. She had exactly enough money for her ticket home, but not enough for both a ticket and another night's lodging. Could I perhaps wait inside the depot again?" Ezra hesitated. "Well, company rules say the waiting room for passengers with tickets, but seeing as you're taking tomorrow's train..." He trailed off, clearly bending regulations out. Of pity, Clara settled onto the familiar bench as darkness fell early under the grey, snow-heavy sky. Through the windows, she could see the warm yellow lights of houses where families gathered for dinner, where women who hadn't been fooled by charming letters and false promises prepared meals for husbands who actually existed. She was pulling her shawl tighter when she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels crunching through the gathering snow. The sounds grew closer, then stopped just outside the depot. Clara looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight from the platform, snow dusting his shoulders and the brim of his hat. The depot door opened with a gust of cold air, and a man stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sandy brown hair and eyes the color of summer sky. His clothes were practical: worn denim, a heavy wool coat, boots that had seen honest work. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He paused when he saw Clara, his gaze taking in her traveling dress, her carpet bag, the way she sat carefully upright despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. "Evening, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was low and pleasant, with a slight drawl that spoke of southern origins. "You waiting for the eastbound?" "Yes," Clara replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded toward Ezra, who had emerged from the office. "Ezra, I need to send a wire to Denver. Stock prices for next week's cattle drive." "Sure thing, Nathaniel, though with this storm, might not go through until morning." "Nathaniel." Clara filed the name away, studying him from beneath her lashes, as he conducted his business with Ezra. There was something solid about him, something reliable that reminded her of the oak trees that had shaded her childhood home in Missouri. When he moved, it was with purpose, but without haste. When he spoke, his words were measured and honest. After sending his telegram, Nathaniel turned back toward Clara. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my asking, you've been waiting here long?" 3 days, Clara answered, then immediately regretted the admission. It made her sound pathetic, abandoned, but Nathaniel's expression showed no pity, only a quiet understanding. "That's a long wait. Storm's getting worse out there. Roads might be impassable by morning." As if to emphasize his point, the wind gusted against the depot windows, rattling the glass and sending a swirl of snow under the door. "Trains delayed until tomorrow," Ezra added helpfully. "Maybe longer if this keeps up." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving between Clara and the storm outside. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, respectful. "Ma'am, I've got a ranch about 8 miles south of here. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. You're welcome to wait out the storm there, if you've a mind to. No strings attached, just a roof over your head until the weather clears and the trains start running again." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't know this man, had no reason to trust him beyond the kindness in his eyes and the honesty in his voice. But the alternative was another night on the depot bench, another night of cold and uncertainty while the storm raged outside. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Nathaniel Hayes," he replied. "Most folks call me Nate. I run cattle on a spread my father left me, been doing it for 7 years now. Ezra here can vouch for me if you've doubts." Ezra nodded vigorously. "Nate's good people, ma'am. Honest as the day is long. Lost his pa to fever a few years back. Been working that ranch alone ever since. He wouldn't offer if he didn't mean it kindly." Clara looked at her hands, pale, soft hands that bore the new calluses from a morning's washing, hands that had never known real work until 3 days ago. Then she looked at Nathaniel Hayes, at the snow gathering on his shoulders, and the patient kindness in his blue eyes. "All right," she said quietly. "I accept your offer, Mr. Hayes, and thank you." Nathaniel's smile was like a sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Just Nate, if you please, and you're most welcome. Let me get your bag." He lifted her carpet bag as if it weighed nothing, then offered her his arm to help her to her feet. Clara accepted it, surprised by the strength in his grip and the steadiness of his presence. As they walked toward the door, Ezra called after them, "You want me to hold a word about the train for you, ma'am?" Clara paused, looking back at the telegrapher who had been kind to her during her 3-day ordeal. "Yes, please. I'll be back." When the storm passes. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, thick flakes that turned the world into a soft, white dream. Nathaniel's wagon waited beside the platform, a sturdy vehicle pulled by two horses who stood patiently despite the weather. He helped Clara up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Get up, boys," he said to the horses, and they moved off into the storm. As the depot lights faded behind them, Clara pulled her shawl tighter and tried not to think about what she was doing, riding off into a blizzard with a stranger, abandoning her plans to return east, trusting her safety to a man she had known for all of 20 minutes. It was either the most foolish thing she had ever done, or the first truly brave thing. The wagon moved steadily through the deepening snow, the horses sure-footed despite the conditions. Nathaniel drove with easy skill, one hand on the reins, the other ready to steady Clara if the wagon hit a rut. He didn't try to make conversation over the wind, for which she was grateful. She needed time to think, to process the sudden change. In her circumstances, 3 days ago, she was Clara Whitmore, bride-to-be, full of hope and dreams for her new life in Colorado. Now she was Clara Whitmore, abandoned woman, riding through a snowstorm with a cowboy she had just met, her future once again uncertain. But for the first time in 3 days, she felt something other than despair stirring in her chest. It might have been hope. It might have been a simple relief at being warm and moving toward shelter, but as she glanced sideways at Nathaniel Hayes's profile in the lamplight from the wagon, as she watched him guide his horses through the storm with calm competence, Clara thought it might be something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like possibility. The Hayes ranch materialized out of the swirling snow like something from a dream. Clara had expected a rough frontier cabin, perhaps a single room with basic furnishings. Instead, lamplight spilled from the windows of a substantial log house, 2 stories tall, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke curled from 2 chimneys, promising warmth within. A large barn loomed nearby, solid and well-maintained, with several smaller outbuildings scattered across what she could see of the property. "Built it up over the years," Nathaniel said, noticing her surprise as he guided the horses toward the barn. "My father started with just the original cabin. That's the kitchen now, added on as the herd grew and profits allowed." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The snow crunched under their feet as they hurried toward the house, Clara's skirts dragging through the accumulating drifts. The wind had picked up during their journey, howling across the open range with a ferocity that made her grateful beyond words for Nathaniel's timely offer. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked brown hair and flour-dusted hands. She was small but sturdy, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of face that suggested she smiled often. "Nate, thank goodness you made it back before this got worse," she said, then paused as she noticed Clara. "Oh my, you didn't mention you were bringing company." "This is Clara Whitmore," Nathaniel said, stomping snow from his boots. "She's been stranded at the depot for 3 days. Clara, this is Mrs. Margaret Sullivan. She keeps the house for me and makes sure I don't starve to death." Margaret's expression immediately softened with maternal concern. 3 days? Oh, you poor dear. Come in before you catch your death. Nate, get those horses settled. This storm's going to be a bad one." The interior of the house was a revelation. The main room featured exposed beam ceilings and a massive stone fireplace where logs crackled cheerfully. The furniture was well made but comfortable, leather chairs worn soft with use, a dining table large enough for 8, bookshelves lined with volumes that showed the wear of frequent reading. Wool rugs covered polished wood floors, and oil paintings of mountain landscapes decorated the walls. "Goodness me, you're chilled to the bone," Margaret said, taking Clara's shawl and guiding her toward the fire. "Sit down here and let me get you something warm to drink. Hot coffee or perhaps some brandy?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you," Clara said, sinking gratefully into one of the leather chairs. The warmth from the fire began to penetrate her clothing, and she realized just how cold she had become during the ride. Margaret bustled about, returning quickly with a steaming mug and a plate of what appeared to be fresh biscuits. "I made these for dinner, but you look like you could use something now. Have you eaten today?" Clara accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "I had breakfast at the depot." It had been a piece of stale bread and weak coffee, but she didn't want to sound ungrateful. "That was hours ago. You'll waste away to nothing if you don't eat properly." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "I'll fix you a proper plate once Nate gets back inside." Clara sipped the coffee, strong and rich, better than anything she had tasted in days, and studied her surroundings more carefully. This wasn't the crude frontier dwelling she had expected. The book suggested education. The artwork showed refined taste, and the general atmosphere spoke of prosperity earned through hard work rather than inherited wealth. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began carefully, "have you worked for Mr. Hayes long?" 5 years now," Margaret replied, settling into the chair across from Clara. "Ever since my husband passed. Nate's father and my William were partners in a freight business. Before they both got into ranching. When Walter died, that's Nate's father, and then my William 6 months later, well, Nate offered me a place here. Said he needed someone to manage the household, and I needed honest work and a roof over my head." "That was very kind of him," Margaret smiled warmly. "Nate's good people, salt of the earth, as my mother would have said, works harder than any 3 men I know, treats everyone fair and square, and never forgot the values his parents taught him. You couldn't ask for better company to be stranded with." The front door opened with a gust of wind and snow, and Nathaniel entered, stamping his feet and shaking snow from his coat. "Horses are settled and fed. This storm's not letting up any time soon. Good thing we got here when we did." He hung his coat and hat on pegs near the door, then joined them by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret with obvious gratitude. Clara found herself studying him covertly as he warmed his hands over the mug. In the lamplight, she could see details she had missed at the depot. His hair was lighter than she had thought, sun-streaked brown with gold highlights. His hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, showed the calluses and small scars of honest labor. There was a scar along his left temple, barely visible, and another on his knuckles. "You mentioned at the depot that you've been waiting 3 days," Nathaniel said, settling back in his chair. "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you to Millbrook in the first place?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but there was no judgment in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Margaret had paused in her knitting to listen, her expression kind, but attentive. "I came to be married," Clara said quietly, "to a man named Theodore Blackwell. We had been corresponding for months, and he proposed through the mail, sent me a ring and a train ticket." Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. "Theodore Blackwell, I know that name. Had dealings with him last spring when I needed supplies for a roundup. Something about him didn't sit right with me." "What kind of dealings?" Clara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Tried to sell me grain at prices well above market rate, claimed it was premium quality. When I examined it closer, found it was mixed with inferior stock. When I confronted him about it, he got defensive, started making excuses. I took my business elsewhere." Margaret made a disgusted sound. That man was nothing but trouble, always. Putting on airs, talking big about his business ventures. Poor Patricia tried to keep up appearances, but everyone could see she was struggling. The children barely had proper clothes. "Patricia," Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "His wife," Margaret said gently. "They have 3 little ones. She's been trying to hold things together since he disappeared, but it's been hard, very hard." Clara stared into the fire, watching the flames dance over the logs. The full scope of Theodore's deception was becoming clear. Not only had he lied to her about being unmarried, he had abandoned his existing family to pursue his schemes. She thought of the letters he had written, full of tender sentiments and promises of devotion. Had any of it been real, or had she simply been another mark in whatever game he was playing? "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's a hard thing to learn, especially after traveling so far." "The strange thing is," Clara said, surprising herself with the admission, "I'm not sure I ever truly loved him. I thought I did, but I think I loved the idea of him, the security he offered, the chance for a new life. I'd convinced myself it was romantic love, but perhaps it was simply desperation." Margaret's knitting needles clicked softly as she worked. "Nothing wrong with wanting security, dear. A woman alone in this world faces challenges men never consider. But real love, when it comes, you'll know the difference." Clara glanced at Nathaniel and found him watching her with those steady blue eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, just a quiet understanding that made something flutter in her chest. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Return to St. Louis, I suppose. The eastbound train should be running again once this storm passes." Clara tried to inject confidence into her voice, but even she could hear the uncertainty. "You have family there?" Clara hesitated. "My mother remarried after my father's death. Her new husband, well, he's made it clear that my presence is temporary at best. But I'll find work. As a governess, perhaps, or a companion. I'm educated, I can read and write well, keep accounts. Someone will need of my skills." "St. Louis is a big city," Margaret observed. "Might be lonely after small-town life." "I've lived in cities before," Clara replied, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, swirling the coffee in his cup. "If you don't mind my saying so, you don't sound entirely enthusiastic about returning east." Clara considered this. He was right, she realized. The thought of going back to St. Louis, of facing her mother's disappointment and her stepfather's cold tolerance, filled her with dread rather than relief. But what alternative did she have? "Sometimes we do what we must rather than what we want," she said finally. "And sometimes," Nathaniel replied, "circumstances give us a chance to choose a different path entirely." Before Clara could ask what he meant by that, Margaret stood up, setting aside her knitting. "Enough serious talk for now. Clara, you look exhausted, and no wonder. Let me show you to your room so you can rest before dinner." The guest bedroom was on the second floor, accessed by a staircase lined with more mountain landscapes. It was simply but comfortably furnished with a double bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with pitcher and basin, and a small writing desk positioned beneath a window that would offer views of the surrounding ranch when daylight returned. "I put fresh linens on the bed this morning," Margaret said, lighting the oil lamp on the bedside table. "There's soap and towels on the washstand, and if you need anything else, just call down. We'll have dinner ready in about an hour." Alone for the first time in days, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, she had been sleeping on a depot bench, counting her remaining coins and planning her humiliating return home. Now she sat in a comfortable bedroom in a prosperous ranch house, having been rescued by a man who seemed too good to be true. She rose and moved to the window, peering out into the storm. Snow was falling so heavily she could barely see the barn, much less any landmarks beyond the immediate yard. The wind howled around the eaves, reminding her how treacherous travel would be until the weather cleared. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Margaret entered, carrying a steaming pitcher of water and fresh towels. "Thought you might like to wash up properly before dinner. I also brought you this." She held up a simple but well-made dress in deep blue wool. "It was mine when I was younger and a bit fuller in the figure. Should fit you well enough, and it's much more practical than that traveling dress for ranch life." Clara accepted the dress gratefully, Her silk dress, beautiful as it was, had never been designed for the realities of frontier living. "Thank you. You've been so kind to a complete stranger." "Nonsense. Out here we help each other when we can. You never know when you might be the one needing assistance." Margaret paused at the door. "That young man downstairs, he's special. Lost his parents too young, had to take on responsibilities that would break most men his age. But he never complained, never gave up, built this place into something his father would be proud of." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret smiled. "Just thought you should know what kind of man offered you shelter tonight. Sleep well, dear." Clara washed with the warm water, grateful to remove the dust and stress of the past 3 days from her skin. The blue dress fit better than she had expected, and she spent a few minutes braiding her hair into a simple style that would be more practical than the elaborate arrangement she had worn for her planned wedding. When she descended for dinner, she found the dining table set for 3 with simple but elegant china. Nathaniel had changed into a clean shirt and combed his hair, though he still looked thoroughly masculine and capable. Margaret had prepared what seemed like enough food for 6 people: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans from what must have been a substantial garden, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. "This is wonderful," Clara said after her first bite. "I haven't had a proper meal in, well, longer than I care to admit." "Margaret's the finest cook in 3 counties, Nathaniel said. "I'm lucky she decided to take pity on a bachelor rancher." "Oh, go on with you," Margaret said, but she looked pleased with the compliment. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Nathaniel told Clara about the ranch, how his father had started with 50 head of cattle and built it up to nearly 500, how they sold beef to mining camps and railroad crews, how he hoped to expand into horse breeding as well. Margaret shared stories of the local community, the families who had become friends over the years, the challenges and rewards of frontier life. Clara found herself relaxing for the first time in days. The warm food, the comfortable surroundings, and the easy companionship created a sense of safety she hadn't realized she had been missing. She told them about her life in St. Louis, her father's work as a banker before his death, her education at a young ladies' academy, her skills with languages and mathematics. "You speak French?" Nathaniel asked, with obvious interest. "Oui, couramment," Clara replied with a smile, "and some German as well. My father believed education was essential for both sons and daughters, though not all of our neighbors agreed with his progressive views." "That's a valuable skill out here," Margaret observed. "We get travelers from all over the world passing through. Mining engineers from Germany, French investors, immigrants heading west. Someone who could help with translation and correspondence would be worth their weight in gold." Clara filed this information away, though she wasn't sure why. She would be leaving once the storm passed, returning to whatever life she could build in St. Louis. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, where Margaret resumed her knitting, and Nathaniel pulled out a worn leather ledger, apparently working on ranch accounts. Clara offered to help with the calculations, and soon found herself seated beside him at the writing desk, adding columns of figures and organizing receipts. "Your handwriting is beautiful," Nathaniel observed, watching her copy figures into a clean ledger. "Much better than my scratching, one of the few practical skills they taught at Miss Pemberton's academy," Clara replied, "along with watercolor painting, piano, and the proper way to serve tea. Not particularly useful skills for frontier living." "Don't be so sure about that," Nathaniel said. "Good record-keeping is essential for any successful business, and beauty has its own value, whether it's in handwriting, music, or art. This country needs people who appreciate such things, not just those who can rope cattle and brand calves." Clara glanced up from the ledger to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. In the lamplight, his eyes seemed deeper, more thoughtful than she had first noticed. There was intelligence there and something else. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "You have beautiful penmanship yourself," she said, looking down at his entries in the ledger. The writing was bold and clear, the letters formed with care despite his claims of inadequacy. "My mother insisted on proper education," he replied. "Said there was no excuse for ignorance, regardless of one's profession. She made sure I could read, write, and cipher properly before she'd let me spend full days working cattle." She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Both my parents were. They built something here that will last, something worth preserving and growing. He paused, then added quietly, "Something worth sharing with the right person." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara felt her cheeks warm and busied herself with the ledger entries. But she was acutely aware of Nathaniel's presence beside her, the warmth of his body, the careful way he moved to avoid brushing against her unnecessarily. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the ranch house, surrounded by lamplight and warmth and the quiet companionship of good people, Clara began to understand what she had been missing in her correspondence with Theodore Blackwell. It wasn't just the lies and deception that made those letters ring false in retrospect. It was the absence of this feeling, this sense of rightness and belonging that seemed to settle over her like a comfortable shawl. When Margaret announced she was retiring for the evening, Clara realized with surprise that several hours had passed. The ledgers were organized, the accounts balanced, and she had learned more about ranch operations than she had ever expected to know. "I should go to bed as well," she said, rising from the desk. "Thank you for dinner and for everything. I know you didn't have to help a stranger, and I'm grateful." Nathaniel stood as well, the courtesy so automatic it spoke of deep-seated good manners. "You're not a stranger anymore," he said simply. "And you're welcome here as long as you need." "To stay?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As she moved toward the staircase, Nathaniel's voice stopped her. "Clara, the storm's supposed to last another day or two, from what I can tell. Even when it passes, the roads will need time to clear before travel is safe. You might be here longer than you planned." She turned back to face him. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, his eyes holding hers steadily. "No, it's not a problem at all." As Clara climbed the stairs to her room, she tried to ignore the way her heart had started beating faster at his words, the way her skin seemed to tingle with awareness. She was a woman who had just escaped one romantic disaster. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for another man, no matter how kind and handsome he might be. But as she prepared for bed in the comfortable guest room, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds of the house settling around her, Clara couldn't deny the growing certainty that something significant was happening, something that had started the moment Nathaniel Hayes had offered his help to a stranded woman and was growing stronger with each passing hour. She fell asleep that night to the sound of wind and snow, but for the first time in 3 days, her dreams were not of abandoned train platforms and broken promises. Instead, she dreamed of steady blue eyes, gentle hands, and a voice that spoke of home. Clara woke to silence. The howling wind that had accompanied her dreams throughout the night had finally stilled, leaving behind an eerie quiet that spoke of deep snow and a world transformed. Pale morning light filtered through the frost-covered window, revealing a landscape she barely recognized. Snow had drifted against the barn doors and covered the fence posts until only their tops remained visible. The storm had indeed been as fierce as Nathaniel had predicted. She dressed quickly in the borrowed blue dress, braided her hair into a practical style, and made her way downstairs. The main room was empty, but she could hear voices from the kitchen, Margaret's cheerful chatter punctuated by Nathaniel's deeper responses. The smell of coffee and bacon drew her forward. "Good morning," she said, from the kitchen doorway. Margaret turned from the stove with a warm smile. "Morning, dear. Sleep well? I was just telling Nate that this storm dumped more snow than we've seen in years. Going to take days to dig out properly." Nathaniel stood near the window, coffee cup in hand, studying the white expanse beyond. He had already been outside, Clara realized. His boots were damp with melted snow, and his hair showed the telltale signs of wind and weather. "Morning, Clara," he said, turning toward her. "Hope the wind didn't keep you awake too much." "I slept better than I have in days," she admitted. "This is the first real bed I've had since leaving St. Louis." Margaret clucked sympathetically while setting a plate of eggs and bacon before Clara. "Well, you'll have plenty of time to catch up on rest. Nate's been checking the roads and they're completely impassable. Won't be safe for travel for at least 3 or 4 days, maybe longer." Clara felt a strange mixture of disappointment and relief at this news. Disappointment because her departure was delayed, her return to whatever life awaited her in St. Louis postponed yet again. But relief, too, because it meant more time in this comfortable haven, more time with people who treated her with kindness and respect rather than pity or judgment. "I hope my extended stay won't be an imposition," she said carefully. "Quite the opposite," Nathaniel replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Margaret's been after me to hire help with the business side of the ranch, someone who can handle correspondence, keep better records, maybe help plan for expansion. Your skills last night impressed me." "Oh, that was nothing. Just basic arithmetic and organization." "More than that," Margaret interjected. "I was watching from my knitting. You have a head for numbers and an eye for detail. Takes Nate twice as long to do what you accomplished in an hour." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at the praise. When had anyone last valued her practical abilities rather than just her appearance or social graces? "I did enjoy the work," she admitted. "It felt good to be useful." "Then maybe you'd be willing to earn your keep while you're here," Nathaniel suggested. "I've been putting off a complete inventory of the ranch assets, livestock, equipment, supplies. Could use someone with your organizational skills to help tackle it properly." "I'd be happy to help," Clara said, surprised by how genuinely she meant it. "Though I warn you, I know nothing about cattle or ranch equipment. You'll have to teach me." Nathaniel's smile was warm enough to melt the snow outside. "I'd be glad to." After breakfast, they began with the barn. Clara had expected a simple structure housing a few horses and some hay, but the Hayes barn was a testament to proper planning and prosperity. The ground floor contained stalls for 8 horses, a tack room lined with saddles and bridles in excellent repair, and storage areas for grain and equipment. A ladder led to a spacious loft packed with sweet-smelling hay. Father designed it. "To be efficient," Nathaniel explained as they moved through the spaces. "Everything has its place. Everything serves a purpose. A well-organized operation saves time and money." Clara pulled out a small notebook Margaret had given her and began making lists. She recorded the number and condition of saddles, bridles, blankets, and tools. Nathaniel provided details about each item, its age, cost, when it might need replacement. She found herself fascinated by the complexity of ranch operations, the way everything interconnected like parts of a large machine. "You're a natural at this," Nathaniel observed, as she efficiently catalogued a collection of horse medicines and veterinary supplies. "Most city folks would be overwhelmed by all the details." "I like systems," Clara replied, making a note about low supplies of liniment. "There's something satisfying about organizing information, making sense of complexity. My father used to let me help with his banking records when I was young. He said I had a talent for seeing patterns others missed." "Your father sounds like he was a progressive man." "He was." Clara's voice softened with memory. "He believed women were capable of far more than society generally allowed. He made sure I received the same quality education as any son would have, despite my mother's protests that it would make me unmarriageable. And did it? Nathaniel asked quietly. Make you unmarriageable, I mean. Clara considered the question seriously. Perhaps. Most men seemed to want a decorative wife, someone who could manage a household and look pretty at social functions. The few who expressed interest in courting me seemed intimidated when they discovered I could discuss literature, mathematics, or politics. Theodore was different, or at least I thought he was. His letters suggested he valued intelligence in a woman. Another lie, then. Yes, though perhaps it was my own wishful thinking as much as his deception. I wanted so desperately to believe that someone would value all of me, not just the parts that fit conventional expectations. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, running, his hand along the smooth leather of a saddle. Intelligence in a woman is a gift, not a flaw. Any man who can't see that isn't worthy of consideration. The conviction in his voice made Clara look up from her notes. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, but before she could analyze it further, he had moved on to the next section of the barn. They spent the morning completing the barn inventory, then moved to the equipment sheds. Clara learned to distinguish between different types of plows, harrows, and cultivators. She recorded the number of fence posts, rolls of wire, and gallons of paint. Nathaniel explained the function of each tool, often demonstrating proper use. Despite the cold weather, "You're a good teacher," Clara observed as he showed her the correct way to handle a branding iron. Patient and thorough. Had to learn patience when father started slowing down, Nathaniel replied. He was determined to pass on everything he knew before he died. Spent 2 years teaching me not just how to do the work, but why we did it certain ways. Said knowledge was the most valuable inheritance he could leave me. How old were you when he died? 23. Old enough to know the basics, young enough to make plenty of mistakes learning the details. Nathaniel's expression grew distant. First winter on my own nearly broke me. Lost 40 head to a blizzard worse than this one because I didn't move them to shelter soon enough. Had to sell off some of the best breeding stock just to keep the ranch operational, but you survived, built it back up. With help from neighbors like Margaret's husband and a lot of stubborn determination. Father always said success wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about learning from them fast enough to stay ahead of failure. By afternoon, they had moved to the main house, working through Margaret's domain with her guidance. Clara inventoried linens, dishes, preserves, and medical supplies, while Margaret shared the stories behind various items. The cut crystal glasses had been Nathaniel's mother's pride, carried carefully in a wagon from Missouri. The extensive collection of preserves represented last summer's garden bounty, planned and processed with military precision. Organization is survival out here, Margaret explained, as Clara noted the quantities of flour, sugar, and coffee in the pantry. Can't just run to the store when you need something. Have to plan ahead, stock up during good weather, make everything last through the lean times. How do you know how much to preserve? Clara asked, genuinely curious. Experience mostly. You learn to calculate based on how many people you're feeding, how long winter might last, what crops grew well that year. It's like solving a puzzle where the pieces change every season. Clara found herself drawn into discussions of meal planning, seasonal cooking, and resource management. These were practical skills no finishing school had taught her, but they required the same logical thinking she had always enjoyed. By evening, she had filled 3 notebooks with detailed inventories and observations. Remarkable work, Nathaniel said as they reviewed her notes over dinner. You've recorded details I'd never thought to track. This will be invaluable for planning future purchases and improvements. I enjoyed it more than I expected, Clara admitted. There's something deeply satisfying about understanding how everything works together, seeing the whole picture instead of just individual pieces. You have a gift for it, Margaret agreed. Reminds me of Nate's mother. She had the same eye, in for detail, same ability to see what needed doing before problems developed. After dinner, Clara helped Margaret with the dishes, while Nathaniel tended to evening chores in the barn. It was the first time she had been alone with the older woman since her arrival, and she found herself curious about her host's background. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began carefully, "you mentioned that Nathaniel's parents were progressive people. What were they like?" Margaret's face lit up with warm memories. "Walter Hayes was one of the finest men I've ever known, honest as the day. Is long, generous to a fault, but with a steel backbone when it came to doing what was right. He treated everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. And Sarah, his wife, was his perfect match. Educated, opinionated, and not afraid to speak her mind when she saw injustice. They sound remarkable. They were. When the territorial government was debating women's suffrage, Sarah organized petition drives and spoke at town meetings. Scandalized some of the more traditional families, but she didn't care. Said if women were expected to help build this territory, they deserved a voice in how it was governed. Clara felt a stirring of recognition. Her own father had held similar views, much to her mother's dismay. That must have been difficult for Nathaniel, growing up with such unconventional parents. "Difficult," Margaret laughed. "Child, that boy was raised to believe women were his equals in every way that mattered. He expects intelligence, opinions, and strength of character from the women in his life. He'd be bored senseless with a simpering, decorative wife who couldn't hold up." Her end of a conversation. The implications of this statement hung in the air between them. Clara felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, Nathaniel's boots sounded on the front porch. He entered carrying a basket of eggs and wearing a satisfied expression. "Hens are settling in well despite the storm. Should have fresh eggs for breakfast tomorrow." "Wonderful," Margaret said. "Clara was just asking about your parents. I was telling her how proud they'd be of what you've accomplished here." Nathaniel's expression grew thoughtful as he set the egg basket on the counter. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm living up to their expectations, building something worthy of their sacrifices." "You are," Clara said with unexpected firmness. "From what I've seen today, you've created exactly the kind of operation they would have wanted. Profitable but principled, efficient but caring." "How can you tell all that from one day of inventory work?" Clara considered her words carefully. "The way you treat your animals. I saw you checking each horse individually, making sure they were comfortable and well fed before attending to equipment. The care you take with tools and machinery, maintaining everything properly rather than replacing it carelessly. The respect you show Margaret, valuing her opinions and expertise. These aren't the actions of someone focused only on profit." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes studying her face. "You see a lot for someone who's only been here one day." "I've had practice observing people and situations quickly. It was a useful skill in social settings, determining who could be trusted and who had hidden motives." "And what's your assessment of me?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Clara felt her pulse accelerate. This was dangerous territory, but something in his expression compelled honesty. "I think you're exactly what you appear to be. Honest, hard-working, kind. A man who keeps his word and treats others the way he wants to be treated. It's refreshing." "Refreshing compared to what?" Clara glanced at Margaret, who had discreetly busied herself organizing the pantry, then back at Nathaniel. "Compared to men who say what they think women want to hear rather than what they actually mean. Men who make promises they can't or won't keep. Men who see women as possessions rather than partners, like Theodore Blackwell, yes, and others before him. Theodore wasn't the first man to disappoint me, just the most devastating, because I'd invested so much hope in his promises." Nathaniel moved closer, his voice gentle. "Not all men are like that, Clara. I'm beginning to understand that, she replied softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and growing awareness. Clara found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way lamplight brought out gold highlights in his hair, the steady warmth in his eyes that made her feel seen and valued in ways she'd never experienced. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. I think I'll retire early tonight. All this snow makes me sleepy. Don't stay up too late, you two. After Margaret disappeared upstairs, Clara and Nathaniel found themselves alone in the kitchen, the air between them electric with unspoken feelings. Clara busied herself putting away the last of the dishes, acutely aware of Nathaniel's presence behind her. Clara, he said quietly. She turned to find him closer than she'd expected, close enough to see the flecks of green in his blue eyes, close enough to catch his scent of soap and leather and something indefinably masculine. I want you to know, he said, his voice carefully controlled, that your room is yours for as long as you need it. No expectations, no pressure. You've been through enough without worrying about unwanted advances from your host. Clara felt something in her chest tighten with gratitude and disappointment in equal measure. Thank you. That means more than you know. But I also want you to know, he continued, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, that having you here, working beside me today, sharing meals and conversation, it's been the best day I've had in longer than I can remember. Her breath caught at his touch, at the sincerity in his voice. Nathaniel. I know it's too soon, he said, stepping back to give her space. I know you're planning to leave. That you have a life waiting for you elsewhere, but I had to tell you that much at least. Clara stood frozen in the lamplight, her heart racing with possibilities she wasn't ready to name. Everything about this man called to her, his gentleness, his strength, his unwavering honesty. But she had been so wrong about Theodore, had trusted, her heart so completely only to have it shattered. How could she trust her feelings again so soon? I should go to bed, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course. Sleep well, Clara. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Clara's mind raced with conflicting emotions. In the space of 2 days, her entire world had shifted. She had come to Colorado Territory to marry one man and found herself impossibly drawn to another. But this time felt different, deeper, more real than anything she had experienced with Theodore. The question was whether she was brave enough to trust her heart again, or whether the fear of another betrayal would send her fleeing back to the safety of her old life before she could discover what might be possible with Nathaniel Hayes. Outside her window, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the world in pristine white and keeping her safe in this haven for at least a few more days. Time enough, perhaps, to find the answer to that question. The fourth morning dawned crystal clear, the storm finally exhausted. Clara woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through her window, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a glittering wonderland. The world looked reborn, pristine, and full of possibility. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, drawn by the sound of animated conversation from the kitchen. "There she is," Margaret called cheerfully. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the day's plans." Nathaniel stood at the window, coffee cup in hand, his expression more serious than Clara had yet seen it. "Roads are still impassable," he said without preamble, "but I need to check on the cattle in the south pasture. They should have weathered the storm well enough, but I need to make sure they can reach water and haven't gotten themselves into trouble." "Trouble?" Clara asked, accepting coffee from Margaret. "Cattle aren't the brightest creatures," Nathaniel explained with a wry smile. "Sometimes they bunch up in corners during storms and can't figure out how to spread back out for grazing. Or they break through fences weakened by snow weight. Nothing catastrophic usually, but problems that get worse if left unattended." "How long will you be gone?" "Most of the day, probably. I'll need to snowshoe out there, check each group, break ice on water troughs, maybe repair some fence if needed. He paused, studying her face. I was wondering if you'd like to come along. It's hard going, but you'd see more of the ranch operation and, well, I'd enjoy the company. Clara felt her pulse quicken, a day alone with Nathaniel working side by side in the winter landscape. It seemed both thrilling and dangerous, given the growing attraction between them. But the alternative was staying behind, wondering what he was doing, counting the hours until his return. I'd like that, she said. Though I should warn you, I've never worn snowshoes in my life. I'll teach you. Margaret, could you pack us some lunch and maybe find Clara some warmer clothes? This work requires more protection than that dress can provide. An hour later, Clara stood in the barn wearing borrowed men's clothes that Margaret had produced from some mysterious source. The wool trousers were too long and had to be rolled up, the heavy coat hung loose around her shoulders, and the boots were stuffed with extra wool to make them fit. But she was warm, and more importantly, she could move freely. You look like a proper ranch hand, Nathaniel said with obvious approval as he adjusted the snowshoe bindings on her feet. These might feel awkward at first, but you'll get the hang of it quickly. He was right. The snowshoes felt clumsy and oversized initially, but Clara soon discovered the rhythm of walking with them. They set off across the white expanse behind. The house, following what Nathaniel assured her was a well-worn path despite being invisible under the snow. Tell me about your cattle, Clara said as they walked. She found that conversation helped distract her from the physical demands of snowshoe hiking. Mixed breeds mostly. Some Herefords for their hardiness, some Shorthorns for beef quality. Father experimented with different bloodlines until he found combinations that thrived in our climate. Nathaniel's voice carried obvious pride in his herd. We're building a reputation for producing cattle that can survive harsh winters, while still providing quality meat. Is that unusual? More challenging than you might think. Breeds that survive well in cold climates often produce tougher meat. Those that provide the best beef sometimes can't handle temperature extremes. Finding the right balance takes years of careful breeding and selection. They crested a small hill, and Clara gasped at the view spread below them. A large meadow stretched toward distant mountains, and scattered across its white surface were dark shapes that resolved into cattle as her eyes adjusted. Perhaps 60 animals stood in loose groups, their breath visible in steamy clouds as they poured through snow to reach grass beneath. They're beautiful, Clara said, surprised by her own reaction. She had expected cattle to be simply livestock, but these animals had an almost majestic quality against the winter landscape. Father always said cattle were partners, not just property, Nathaniel replied. Treat them well, and they'll support your family for generations. Neglect them, and they'll break you financially and spiritually. They spent the next several hours moving from group to group. Nathaniel checked each animal for signs of injury or illness, broke ice on frozen water troughs with a heavy mallet, and repaired 2 sections of fence where snow load had snapped wire. Clara helped where she could, but mostly she watched and learned, fascinated by Nathaniel's easy competence with both animals and equipment. You have a natural way with them, she observed, as a large bull approached Nathaniel without fear, allowing himself to be examined for cuts or injuries. They know me, Nathaniel replied, running practiced hands along the bull's legs and flanks. I've been working with this herd since I was tall enough to see over their backs. Cattle have long memories. They remember who treats them kindly and who doesn't. Clara watched the interaction with growing admiration. There was something deeply appealing about a man who could be gentle with creatures that outweighed him by hundreds of pounds, who earned trust through consistency and kindness rather than force. They ate lunch, sitting on a fallen log, sharing sandwiches and hot coffee from a thermos, while the cattle grazed peacefully around them. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through bare aspen branches. Can I ask you something? Clara said finally. Of course! Yesterday, when we were talking about your parents, Margaret mentioned that your mother was involved in women's suffrage efforts. That's unusual for a rancher's wife, isn't it? Nathaniel smiled, his expression growing distant with memory. Mother was unusual in many ways. She believed that frontier life required frontier thinking, that old social rules didn't necessarily apply when survival depended on everyone contributing their best efforts, regardless of gender. Your father supported her political activities, encouraged them. He used to say that anyone smart enough to help build a ranch was smart enough to vote for territorial representatives. Nathaniel's voice grew warmer. They were true partners. In every sense. Mother kept books, negotiated cattle prices, even helped with roundups when extra hands were needed. Father valued her opinions on everything from breeding decisions to business expansion. Clara felt a pang of longing at this description. That sounds like a remarkable marriage. It was. They set a high standard for what partnership could look like. Nathaniel glanced at her sideways. Made it difficult to consider settling for anything less. The implication hung between them like the visible breath in the cold air. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the temperature. Is that why you never married? Because you couldn't find a woman who measured up to your mother? Partly, Nathaniel admitted. But also because most women I've met were looking for security or social status rather than genuine partnership. They saw the ranch as a comfortable refuge, not something they wanted to help build and improve. And you want a woman who shares your ambitions. I want a woman who has ambitions of her own, he said simply. Someone who sees possibilities where others see only problems. Someone who can challenge my thinking and push me to be better than I am alone. Clara stared out at the peaceful herd, processing his words. This was so different from Theodore's vision of marriage, a wife as ornament and helpmate, beautiful and useful, but fundamentally subordinate. What Nathaniel described sounded like the kind of partnership she had dreamed of, but never dared hope to find. You're describing a very rare woman, she said carefully. Rarer than I'd hoped, he agreed. But it's worth waiting for. They finished lunch in contemplative silence, then resumed their work. By mid-afternoon, they had checked every animal and completed necessary repairs. Clara felt tired but exhilarated, her cheeks stinging from cold and wind, but her spirits higher than they had been in months. One more stop, Nathaniel said, as they prepared to head home. I want to check the line cabin. The line cabin proved to be a small but sturdy structure nestled among pine trees at the edge of the pasture. It contained basic supplies for cowboys working in distant parts of the ranch. A wood stove, simple furniture, shelves stocked with preserved food and emergency medical supplies. Father built it after getting caught in a blizzard with no shelter. Nathaniel explained as he checked the stove and supply levels. Said no one should risk freezing to death just because they were too far from the main house when the weather turned bad. Clara examined the cabin's efficient layout with professional interest. Everything was organized for maximum utility and minimum space, bed, table, cooking area and storage, all arranged with careful thought. It's like a perfectly planned miniature house. Mother designed the interior layout. She had a gift for making small spaces functional and comfortable. Nathaniel lit the stove to test its draw, filling the cabin with warmth and the pleasant scent of burning wood. She also stocked it with books and games. Said even cowboys needed mental stimulation during long stays. Clara examined the small bookshelf with delight. The collection was eclectic. Adventure novels, poetry, agricultural journals, even a volume of Shakespeare. Your mother had excellent taste in literature. She believed everyone deserved access to good books, regardless of their formal education. Nathaniel joined her at the bookshelf. Some of the cowboys who worked for my father learned to read during winter evenings in this cabin. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. I think she would have liked you." The words were spoken quietly, but they hit Clara with unexpected force. She turned to find Nathaniel watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In the warm glow of the wood stove, his eyes seemed deeper, more serious than ever. "Why do you say that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you have the same quality she had, the ability to see potential where others see only problems, the intelligence to understand complex situations quickly, the courage to adapt and learn, rather than simply accepting circumstances as unchangeable." Clara felt her heart begin to race. "Nathaniel, I know it's too soon," he said, stepping closer. "I know you're planning to leave, that you have reasons to be cautious about trusting another man so quickly. But Clara, what I feel for you isn't pity or simple attraction. It's recognition. Recognition of someone I could build a life with. Someone who could be a true partner, not just a wife." His voice grew rougher with emotion. "I've been waiting 30 years to feel this way about a woman, and I'm not sure I can let you walk away without telling you that." Clara's mind reeled. Everything she had learned about Nathaniel over the past few days suddenly crystallized into understanding. His kindness wasn't mere politeness, it was genuine care. His respect for her abilities wasn't flattery, it was sincere appreciation. And the growing warmth between them wasn't just attraction, it was the foundation of something much deeper. But the fear was still there, sharp and insistent. Theodore's betrayal had shattered her confidence in her own judgment. How could she trust these feelings when she had been so wrong before? "I'm frightened," she admitted, the words torn from her before she could stop them. "Of me, of this, trusting my heart again when it led me so wrong before." Tears pricked at her eyes. What if I'm making the same mistake? What if I'm seeing what I want to see rather than what's really there? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he moved to the cabin's small table and pulled out a chair. "Sit down," he said gently. "Let me tell you something about the difference between what Theodore offered you and what I'm offering." Clara sat, wrapping her arms around herself as much for emotional comfort as physical warmth. "Theodore made you promises about a life he couldn't or wouldn't deliver," Nathaniel began, taking the opposite chair. "He told you what he thought you wanted to hear rather than what he could actually provide. He painted pictures of a future that existed only in his imagination or his lies." Clara nodded, remembering the elaborate descriptions in Theodore's letters of their future home, their social position, their comfortable life together. "What I'm offering is different," Nathaniel continued. "I'm not promising you ease or luxury or social status. I'm promising you a partnership in building something real and lasting. I'm offering you the chance to use your abilities, to grow and learn and contribute to something larger than yourself." "But how do I know?" "Because you've seen it," he interrupted gently. "You've worked beside me, seen how I treat the people and animals in my care, witnessed the life I've actually built, rather than just hearing descriptions of some imaginary future. You've met Margaret, who's known me for years and can tell you exactly what kind of man I am. You've lived in my house, seen my books, examined my business records." Clara realized he was right. Everything she knew about Nathaniel was based on direct observation rather than promises or claims. She had seen his character in action, not just heard about it in letters. "Theodore offered you a dream," Nathaniel said. "I'm offering you reality, all of it, the hard work and challenges along with the rewards. The question isn't whether you can trust me to be who I appear to be. The question is whether you want the kind of life I can actually offer." Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching voices outside the cabin made them both freeze. Nathaniel's expression immediately shifted to alert caution. "Stay here," he said quietly, moving to the window. We're not expecting anyone, and most folks know better than to venture out in snow this deep without good reason. Clara's heart hammered as she watched him peer through the frosted glass. After everything they had just shared, the last thing she wanted was an interruption, especially one that might bring danger. 3 riders, Nathaniel said grimly. They're struggling through the snow, but they're definitely heading this way. I don't recognize them from this distance. As the riders drew closer, Clara could see them through the window. 3 men on horseback, their animals laboring through the deep snow. Something about their approach seemed purposeful rather than accidental, as if they knew exactly where they were going. "Nathaniel Hayes," one of the riders called out as they reached the cabin. "We need to talk to you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he moved to the door. "Wait here," he told Clara firmly, "until I know what this is about." As he stepped outside to face the unexpected visitors, Clara pressed herself against the window, straining to hear the conversation that was about to unfold. Whatever these men wanted, their arrival felt ominous, like a dark cloud moving across the perfect day she and Nathaniel had shared together. Clara pressed herself against the cabin window, her heart pounding as she watched Nathaniel step outside to face the 3 riders. Even from inside, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself between the strangers and the cabin door where she waited. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "You're a long way from any main road. What brings you out in weather like this?" The lead rider, a heavy-set man with a thick beard and expensive city clothes, dismounted with obvious difficulty. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, suggesting they had ridden hard to get here. The other 2 men remained mounted, flanking their leader in a formation that spoke of either military training or less savory experience. "Name's Marcus Kellerman," the bearded man announced, pulling off his gloves and flexing fingers red with cold. "I represent certain business interests in Denver. We've been looking for someone, and our inquiries led us to believe she might be here." Clara's blood turned to ice. Somehow, impossibly, they had tracked her to this remote ranch. But who were they, and what did they want with her? "I'm not sure what you mean," Nathaniel replied carefully. "This is private property, and I wasn't expecting visitors. Don't play games with me, Hayes." Kellerman's tone turned harsh. "We know about the woman you picked up at the Millbrook station, Clara Whitmore. We have business with her." "What kind of business?" Nathaniel's voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet that made Clara shiver. "The kind that's none of your concern." One of the mounted men spoke for the first time, his hand resting casually on the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. "Just bring her out and we'll be on our way." "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," Nathaniel said, and Clara could see him shift his weight slightly, preparing for trouble. "Miss Whitmore is under my protection, and she's not going anywhere with strangers who won't state their business plainly." Kellerman laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Protection? Son, you don't know what you're dealing with. This woman owes money to some very serious people in St. Louis, people who don't appreciate being taken for fools." Clara's mind raced as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Her father's debts after his death, her mother's hasty remarriage to the banker, the eager way her stepfather had encouraged her departure for Colorado. It all suddenly made horrible sense. "Even if that were true," Nathaniel said steadily, "it wouldn't give you the right to collect debts through intimidation and threats." "Wouldn't it?" The second mounted man spoke now, urging his horse closer to Nathaniel. "Some debts can't be settled with lawyers and paperwork, especially when the debtor tries to run away to avoid paying." Clara could stand it no longer. Whatever was happening, Nathaniel was facing danger because of her, and she couldn't hide behind the cabin door. While he defended her against accusations she didn't understand, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside into the bitter cold. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she announced, her voice carrying despite her fear. "What exactly do you think I owe, and to whom?" All three men turned toward her, and Clara felt Nathaniel move, protectively closer to her side. Kellerman's eyes lit up with satisfaction at seeing his quarry. Well, well, the famous bride-to-be. Kellerman's smile was predatory. "Your stepfather, Miss Whitmore, borrowed a considerable sum from my employers to cover certain irregularities in his banking practices. When territorial auditors began asking uncomfortable questions, he needed quick cash to make his books balance." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "That's impossible. My mother married a respectable banker." "Respectable?" Kellerman laughed harshly. "Harold Morrison has been skimming deposits and forging loan documents for years. When we approached him for repayment, he offered an interesting alternative arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice deadly quiet. "A marriage contract," Kellerman replied, clearly enjoying Clara's shock. "Seems Morrison had a stepdaughter who was conveniently planning to travel west for a wedding. He arranged for her to marry one of our associates instead, a man who needed a respectable wife to help establish himself in legitimate business." Clara's legs nearly gave way as understanding crashed over her. "Theodore Blackwell works for you." "Worked," Kellerman corrected. Past tense. "Theodore was supposed to marry you and bring you back to St. Louis, where you'd serve as collateral for your stepfather's debt. When he decided to run off with our money instead of completing his assignment, it became necessary to collect you ourselves." Collateral. Nathaniel's voice had turned deadly. "You're talking about slavery." "We're talking about business," the first gunman replied coldly. "The girl's stepfather owes us $50,000. She can work off that debt in businesses we operate, or we can take our losses out of Morrison's hide. Makes no difference. To us." Clara found her voice through the horror. "I had nothing to do with his borrowing. I didn't even know." "Doesn't matter," Kellerman interrupted. "Morrison made you part of the deal when he offered you as collateral. You became our property the moment you stepped on that train to Colorado." "She's not property," Nathaniel said, and Clara could hear the barely controlled rage in his voice. "She's a human being with rights under territorial law." "Territorial law?" The second gunman laughed. "Son, we are the law where we come from, and we've come a long way to collect what's ours." Clara's mind raced through everything she had learned in the past few minutes. Her stepfather wasn't the respectable banker she had believed. He was a criminal who had used her as collateral for his illegal debts. Theodore Blackwell hadn't been a legitimate suitor, but an agent sent to trap her in a fake marriage. And now these men wanted to drag her back to St. Louis to work off debts she had never incurred. "I won't go with you," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Whatever my stepfather promised, I had no part in making that agreement." "You don't have a choice," Kellerman replied, "but we're reasonable men. Come along quietly and no one gets hurt. 'Cause Trouble and your cowboy friend here might have an unfortunate accident." The threat was clear, and Clara saw Nathaniel's jaw tighten with controlled fury. She also noticed that he was slowly positioning himself for action, his right hand moving incrementally toward the gun holstered at his hip. "How did you find me?" Clara asked, buying time while trying to think of some way out of this nightmare. "Theodore might have run off with our money, but he was smart enough to stay in contact," Kellerman explained. "When he heard about a stranded bride at Millbrook Station, he put two and two together and sent word. We've been tracking you for days, so Theodore is still alive? For now. But his usefulness has come to an end. Yours, however, is just beginning." Clara felt sick at the casual way Kellerman discussed human lives as business assets. These weren't men who could be reasoned with or appealed to. They were predators who saw her as nothing more than valuable property to be collected and exploited. "Enough talking," the first gunman said, dismounting from his horse. "Let's collect the girl and get out of here before this weather gets worse." "Stay back," Nathaniel warned, his hand now resting openly on his gun. This is my land, and Miss Whitmore is under my protection. You're not taking her anywhere." "3 against 1, Cowboy," the second gunman pointed out, also dismounting. "Might want to reconsider your position." "Might want to consider yours," Nathaniel replied calmly. "You're trespassing on private property, threatening a woman under my protection, and openly discussing kidnapping and human trafficking. Even if you kill me, how do you plan to explain 3 dead bodies to the territorial marshal?" "Who says anyone will find the bodies?" Kellerman asked, with a cold smile. The situation was spiraling toward violence, and Clara realized with crystal clarity that she couldn't allow Nathaniel to be hurt, defending her from problems that weren't his fault. She also realized something else. She would rather die fighting these men than allow herself to be dragged back to whatever hell they had planned for her. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. "Before this goes any further, I have questions." "You're not in a position to ask questions," Kellerman snapped. "Actually, I am," Clara replied with growing confidence. "If my stepfather really owes you money, and if you really intend to use me to settle his debts, then I'm valuable to you, alive and unharmed. Which means you need my cooperation more than you're willing to admit." Kellerman's eyes narrowed. "What's your point?" "My point is that I'm an educated woman with valuable skills. Whatever work you have in mind, I'll be more useful if I'm cooperative rather than constantly trying to escape. So let me ask my questions, and I'll consider your proposal." It was a desperate bluff, but Clara saw uncertainty flicker across Kellerman's face. She was buying time and hoping for some opportunity to turn the situation to their advantage. "Ask your questions," he said finally. "First, what proof do you have that my stepfather actually owes you money? I want to see documents, contracts, something more than your word." Kellerman hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Promissory note signed and witnessed. $50,000 borrowed against future earnings from his bank, with you specifically named as collateral. Clara took the document with hands that trembled only slightly. The signature was definitely Harold Morrison's, and the terms were exactly as Kellerman had described. She felt sick reading the clause that designated her as human collateral to be surrendered upon demand. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "It's business," Kellerman replied coldly. "Are you satisfied that the debt is legitimate?" "Second question," Clara continued, forcing herself to remain calm. "What exactly would this work involve?" "You'd be employed in various enterprises we operate. Saloons, gambling houses, private clubs. An educated, beautiful woman can earn good money entertaining wealthy clients if she's properly motivated." The euphemistic language didn't disguise the reality of what he was describing. Clara felt Nathaniel tense beside her, and knew he was probably seconds away from drawing his gun regardless of the odds. "And if I refuse? Then your debt becomes Morrison's problem again, and he suffers the consequences. We also have long memories about people who cause us trouble." The threat was clear: refuse to cooperate, and both she and her stepfather would face violent retribution. Clara found herself in the impossible position of choosing between her own freedom and another person's life, even if that person had betrayed her trust. "I need time to think," she said finally. "You've had enough time," the first gunman said impatiently. "Let's finish this." But as he stepped toward Clara, Nathaniel finally acted. His gun cleared leather with practiced speed, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked, freezing everyone in place. "I believe the lady said she needs time to think," Nathaniel said quietly. "And I believe you gentlemen need to step back and give her that time." "You can't fight all 3 of us," Kellerman said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Nathaniel admitted, "but I guarantee you won't leave here alive if you try to take her by force. Is collecting this debt worth dying for?" For a moment, the tableau held, 5 people standing in the snow beside a remote cabin, the only sounds of their visible breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. Clara could feel the violence hanging in the air like a physical presence, waiting for the slightest provocation to explode. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the tension. Someone else was coming, and coming fast. What the hell? Kellerman began, then stopped as 4 riders crested the hill and rode toward them at a gallop. Even at a distance, Clara could see they wore badges that glinted in the afternoon sunlight. "Territorial marshals," Nathaniel said with obvious relief. "Right on time." "You called for law?" Kellerman demanded. "Didn't need to," Nathaniel replied with a slight smile. "But my neighbor Tom Bradford was supposed to check on my cattle today. When he saw tracks from your horses leading toward my ranch, he got curious. Tom's suspicious of strangers, especially ones who ride through heavy snow to reach isolated ranches." The marshals approached with weapons drawn, clearly prepared for trouble. Their leader, a grizzled man with silver hair and hard eyes, surveyed the scene with professional interest. "Afternoon, Nate," he called. "Tom Bradford sent word you might have unwelcome visitors. Everything is all right here?" "Getting better by the minute, Marshal Cameron," Nathaniel replied, never lowering his gun. "These gentlemen were just explaining how they plan to kidnap Miss Whitmore here to settle debts she didn't incur." "That's so." Marshal Cameron's voice turned deadly serious. "Well, gentlemen, kidnapping is a federal offense in Colorado territory. I'm going to have to ask you to put your hands where I can see them." As the 3 criminals were disarmed and arrested, Clara felt her knees finally give way. Nathaniel caught her before she could fall, his strong arm surrounding her with warmth and safety. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now." But even as relief flooded through her, Clara knew this was far from over. Harold Morrison was still in St. Louis, still in debt to dangerous people. And somewhere, Theodore Blackwell was still alive, still a potential threat. The document in her hand proved that her stepfather had literally sold her to settle his debts. She was free from immediate danger, but the larger web of deceit and criminality that had ensnared her was far from unraveled. The ride back to the main house passed in a blur of swirling thoughts and conflicting emotions. Clara sat beside Nathaniel in the wagon, the damning promissory note clutched in her trembling hands, while Marshal Cameron and his deputies escorted their prisoners ahead of them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow, and despite her heavy coat, Clara couldn't stop shivering. "We need to get you warm and fed," Nathaniel said, glancing at her with concern. "You've had enough shocks for one day." "I keep thinking this is all some horrible nightmare," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I'll wake up and discover none of this is real." "It's real," Nathaniel said gently, "but it's also over. Those men can't hurt you now." "Can't they?" Clara looked down at the document in her hands. "This says I'm collateral for $50,000. Even with them in jail, that debt still exists. And my stepfather—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Your stepfather made his own choices," Nathaniel said firmly. "You're not responsible for his crimes or his debts." They reached the house to find Margaret waiting on the porch, her face tight with worry. News traveled fast in ranch country, and Tom Bradford had apparently stopped to warn her about the situation before riding to fetch the marshals. "Thank God." "You're both safe," Margaret exclaimed, hurrying down the steps to help Clara from the wagon. "Come inside immediately. I've got hot soup ready and a fire blazing." The kitchen felt like a sanctuary after the confrontation at the line cabin. Clara allowed Margaret to fuss over her, accepting hot soup and strong coffee, while Nathaniel spoke quietly with Marshal Cameron at the dining table. She could hear fragments of their conversation, discussions of federal charges, extradition, proceedings, and something about sending telegrams to authorities in St. Louis. "Mrs. Sullivan," Clara said quietly, needing to focus on something concrete rather than the larger implications of her situation. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, dear. Anything. If someone you trusted, someone you thought you knew, turned out to be completely different from what you believed, how would you ever trust your judgment again?" Margaret's weathered hands stilled on the dishcloth she was folding. She studied Clara's face with the kind of maternal understanding that sees straight through surface questions to deeper fears. "You're asking about more than your stepfather, aren't you?" Margaret said gently. Clara nodded, tears threatening. "How do I know what's real anymore? I thought Theodore was an honest merchant who loved me. I thought my stepfather was a respectable banker who cared about my welfare. I was wrong about everything. What if I'm wrong about—" She glanced toward Nathaniel, unable to finish the sentence. "What if you're wrong about Nate?" Margaret completed the thought. "Yes." Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down across from Clara, her expression serious but kind. "Child, let me tell you something about the difference between deception and truth. Deception requires constant effort to maintain. The person has to remember their lies, keep their stories straight, hide their real nature behind a mask they've created. Yes, I understand that now. But truth," Margaret continued, "truth is effortless. It's consistent whether you're watching someone in public or private, whether they're happy or stressed, whether they think anyone is paying attention or not." Clara considered this, remembering the past few days. Nathaniel's behavior had been completely consistent, kind to his animals, respectful to Margaret, honest in his business dealings, protective without being possessive. "Theodore wrote you beautiful letters," Margaret observed, "but when you met him in person, he wasn't there at all. Nate has never written you a single letter, but he's shown you who he is through his actions every day since you arrived. But how can I trust my feelings when they led me so wrong before?" "Because your feelings about Theodore were based on fantasy," Margaret replied. "You fell in love with letters, with promises, with the idea of a man rather than the man himself. What you feel for Nate is based on reality, on working beside him, seeing how he treats others, experiencing his character firsthand." Before Clara could respond, Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Clara, Marshal Cameron would like to speak with you when you're ready. There are some legal matters we need to discuss." Clara nodded, grateful for Margaret's words, but still uncertain about everything. She followed Nathaniel to the dining room, where Marshal Cameron sat with papers spread across the table and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Miss Whitmore," the Marshal began without preamble, "I've been going through the documents these men were carrying, and I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially understood." Clara's heart sank. "How so?" "The promissory note you showed me is legitimate, but it's only part of a larger criminal enterprise. We found correspondence indicating that your stepfather, Harold Morrison, has been involved in a loan shark operation that spans multiple territories. The men we arrested today represent just one branch of a much larger organization." "What does that mean for Clara?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight with concern. "It means that even with these particular criminals in custody, there may be others who consider Miss Whitmore an asset to be collected," Cameron replied bluntly. "The debt arrangement names her specifically, and criminal organizations tend to have long memories and persistent collection methods." Clara felt the room spin slightly. Just when she thought she was safe, new threats emerged from the shadows of her stepfather's crimes. "However," Cameron continued, "there are legal remedies available. If Miss Whitmore is willing to testify against Morrison and provide information about his criminal activities, federal prosecutors might be willing to void the debt arrangement as part of a larger case against the organization." "Testify?" Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "It would mean returning to St. Louis for trial proceedings. You'd be under federal protection, but it would require you to face your stepfather in court and detail everything you know about his activities." Clara's mind raced. Returning to St. Louis meant leaving Colorado, leaving the ranch, leaving Nathaniel, but it also meant potentially freeing herself from the debt that made her a target for criminal collection efforts. "What if I don't testify?" she asked. "Then you remain legally bound by the debt arrangement," Cameron said honestly. "Other collectors may come looking for you, and you'd have no legal protection against their claims." "How long would the trial? Proceedings take several months, possibly longer if there are appeals." "But Miss Whitmore, there's something else you should know." Cameron's expression grew even more serious. "We've received word from authorities in St. Louis that Harold Morrison has disappeared. He cleared out his bank accounts and left town 3 days ago." Clara stared at him in shock. "He's gone? Completely, along with whatever money he could liquidate quickly. His wife, your mother, claims she knew nothing about his criminal activities and has filed for divorce." The news hit Clara like a physical blow. Her stepfather had not only used her as collateral for his criminal debts, he had abandoned her to face the consequences alone while he escaped with stolen money. "So he left my mother too," Clara said, her voice hollow. "I'm afraid so. She's currently staying with relatives and cooperating with federal investigators, but her financial situation is difficult." Clara buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the scope of betrayal and abandonment she had suffered. First Theodore, then her stepfather, and now even the indirect abandonment by her mother, who had chosen Harold Morrison over her own daughters. "Welfare, Clara." Nathaniel's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She raised her head to find him watching her with steady blue eyes that held no pity, only determination. "Whatever you decide about testifying, whatever you choose to do about these legal complications, you need to know something," he said. "You have a place here, not as a guest, not as someone we're sheltering temporarily, but as part of this family. Nathaniel, I'm not finished." His voice carried quiet authority. "I've watched you work, seen how you think and adapt and contribute. You're not the helpless victim these criminals think you are. You're a strong, intelligent woman who can build whatever life she chooses." Margaret nodded approvingly from the kitchen doorway, where she had been listening. "Nate's right. You've proven yourself here in ways that matter." Marshal Cameron cleared his throat diplomatically. "Miss Whitmore, you don't have to decide about testifying tonight. Federal prosecutors will need time to build their case anyway. But I do need to know, do you feel safe staying here while legal proceedings move forward?" Clara looked around. The warm, comfortable room, at the man who had risked his life defending her, at the woman who had welcomed her like a daughter, at the marshal who was working to ensure her safety. For the first time since stepping off the train at Millbrook Station, she felt like she had allies rather than enemies. "Yes," she said firmly, "I feel safe here." "Good." Cameron gathered his papers efficiently. "I'll contact federal prosecutors and arrange for them to interview you when you're ready. In the meantime, my office will keep you informed of any developments in the case." After the marshal left, Clara found herself alone with Nathaniel and Margaret in the sudden quiet of evening. The emotional upheaval of the day had left her drained but strangely clear-headed about certain truths. "I want to testify," she announced, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Are you certain?" Nathaniel asked. "It won't be easy." "I'm certain. Harold Morrison used me as collateral in criminal enterprises, then abandoned me to face the consequences when his schemes collapsed. He deserves to face justice for what he's done, not just to me, but to many other people he's defrauded." "It will mean months in St. Louis," Margaret observed gently, "away from everything you've found here." Clara met Nathaniel's eyes across the table. That depends on whether what I've found here will still be here when I return. Always, Nathaniel said without hesitation, for as long as you want it to be. The simple promise, spoken with absolute sincerity, settled something deep in Clara's chest. This wasn't like Theodore's elaborate declarations of love or Harold Morrison's false assurances of paternal care. This was a man stating a simple fact about his intentions. Then I'll go to St. Louis and testify, Clara said, and when it's over, I'll come home. The word slipped out before she could stop it, but Clara realized she meant it completely. Home wasn't the city where she was born or the house where she grew up. Home was wherever she could build a life with people who valued her for who she truly was. In that case, Nathaniel said, reaching across the table to take her hand, there's something we should discuss before you leave. What's that? What kind of life do you want to come home to? His thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles. Because I'd like to spend the time you're gone making improvements to the ranch, adding rooms to the house, expanding the business, operations, maybe investigating those horse breeding plans I mentioned. Clara felt her heart begin to race. That sounds like you're planning for permanent changes. I am. Nathaniel's eyes held hers steadily. I'm planning for a partner, Clara, someone who can help me build something lasting and worthwhile, someone who shares my vision for what this place could become. A business partner? Clara asked, though her voice suggested she understood he meant much more. A life partner, Nathaniel clarified, in every sense of the word. If you'll have me. The proposal was characteristically straightforward, without flowery speeches or dramatic gestures. Just an honest man offering to share his life with a woman he respected and loved. Yes, Clara said, surprised by how easily the answer came. Yes, I'll have you. Margaret clapped her hands together with delight. About time. I was beginning to wonder if you two were going to talk around your feelings forever. Nathaniel rose from his chair and moved around the table to Clara, offering his hand to help her stand. When she did, he cupped her face gently in his calloused palms. I love you, Clara Whitmore, he said simply, not for what you might become or what you represent, but for exactly who you are right now. I love you too, Clara replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being, and I'm not afraid anymore. When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of a man who had found something precious, and the strength of someone who would protect it with his life. Clara felt all her doubts and fears melt away, replaced by certainty that she had finally found where she belonged. The road ahead would still be challenging. She would have to return to St. Louis, face her stepfather in court, and testify about criminal activities that had nearly destroyed her life. But she would do it all, knowing that Nathaniel Hayes was waiting for her return, building a future they would share. As they stood together in the lamplight, surrounded by the warmth of home and the promise of tomorrow, Clara realized that being abandoned at Millbrook Station had been the best thing that ever happened to her. It had led her away from a life built on lies and toward a love built on truth. Sometimes, she thought as Nathaniel held her close, the most beautiful journeys begin with the most devastating departures. Clara Whitmore stood in the witness box, her voice steady and clear as she recounted the events that had brought her to this moment. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and curious spectators who had followed the sensational case of the criminal banking conspiracy that had reached across multiple territories. And did Mr. Morrison ever inform you that he was using you as collateral for illegal loans? The federal prosecutor asked. Never, Clara replied firmly. The first I learned of any such arrangement was when Marcus Kellerman and his associates attempted to collect me from the Hayes Ranch in Colorado Territory. She had been testifying for 3 days now, methodically dismantling Harold Morrison's defense that his stepdaughter had been a willing participant in his criminal schemes. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case against the banking conspiracy, with Clara's testimony serving as a crucial link between Morrison's embezzlement and the broader criminal organization. In the defendant's chair, Harold Morrison looked older and smaller than Clara remembered. The confident banker who had married her mother 2 years ago had been replaced by a haggard man in an ill-fitting suit, his lies finally catching up with him. He avoided meeting Clara's eyes throughout her testimony. "No further questions, Your Honor," the prosecutor announced. As Clara stepped down from the witness stand, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the gallery. Her mother, Elizabeth Morrison, who had attended every day of the trial, despite the shame and financial ruin Harold's crimes had brought to her life. Elizabeth offered a small, sad smile that Clara returned with genuine warmth. The months of legal proceedings had slowly rebuilt the relationship between mother and daughter, though it would never be quite the same. The defense attorney's closing arguments were perfunctory at best. The evidence against Harold Morrison was overwhelming, and his own abandoned family members had testified against him with devastating effectiveness. When the jury returned after only 2 hours of deliberation, their verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison's sentencing was equally decisive. "Mr. Morrison, your crimes represent a profound betrayal of public trust and personal responsibility. You used your position as a banker to defraud investors, manipulated legal documents to hide your theft, and when discovered, you attempted to use your own stepdaughter as collateral for criminal debts. This court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison." Clara felt no satisfaction in Harold Morrison's downfall, only relief that the chapter of her life defined by his betrayal was finally closed. As the marshals led him away, she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the courthouse for the last time. "Clara." Elizabeth Morrison approached hesitantly as Clara reached the courthouse steps. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Mother." They walked together toward the hotel where Elizabeth had been staying during the trial. The older woman looked frail and uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident banker's wife she had been before Harold's arrest. "I need to apologize," Elizabeth said finally, "for choosing Harold over your welfare, for not seeing what kind of man he really was, for encouraging you to leave for Colorado when I should have protected you." Clara considered her response carefully. The hurt and anger she had carried for months had gradually transformed into something more complex during the trial proceedings. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. "You couldn't have known he was planning to use me as collateral," Clara said gently. "His deception was thorough and convincing, but I should have known something was wrong. A mother should protect her children, not push them toward danger because it's convenient for her new marriage." "You were grieving father's death and trying to secure your own future," Clara replied. "Harold manipulated both of us, just in different ways." Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. "What will you do now?" "The trial is over. Harold's assets have been seized to pay restitution, and you're free from any legal obligation to his debts." "I'm going home," Clara said simply. "To the ranch in Colorado." "Yes, Nathaniel and I are to be married next month." Elizabeth's expression was complex, sadness at losing her daughter to distance, but genuine happiness at Clara's obvious contentment. "He seems like a good man from what you've told me." "He is. He's honest, hard-working, and he values me as a partner rather than simply a wife." Clara paused, then added gently, "You're welcome to visit us, Mother. The ranch is remote, but there's always room for family." "Thank you, dear. I'd like that when I've sorted out my own situation." Elizabeth had been staying with her sister since Harold's arrest, slowly rebuilding her life from the wreckage of her second marriage. "I'm proud of how strong you've become. Your father would be proud too. They parted at the hotel with genuine affection, their relationship scarred but not broken by the events of the past year. Clara returned to her own modest lodgings to pack for the journey back to Colorado Territory, her heart already racing with anticipation. The westbound train hissed to a stop at the same platform where Clara had waited desperately 6 months earlier. But this time, she wasn't alone. Nathaniel Hayes stood beside the tracks in his best suit, his face lighting up with joy as Clara appeared in the doorway of the passenger car. "Welcome home," he said, lifting her down from the train and spinning her around in an embrace that drew approving smiles from other passengers. "I missed you terribly," Clara murmured against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar sense of leather and soap that meant safety and love. "Never again," Nathaniel promised, setting her gently on her feet, but keeping his arms around her. "No more separations, no more waiting." The wagon ride to the ranch revealed the improvements Nathaniel had made during her absence. New fence lines, stretched across pastures that seemed greener and more extensive than before. A second barn had been constructed to house the breeding horses he had mentioned, and the main house showed signs of expansion. "You've been busy," Clara observed, her eyes taking in the evidence of prosperity and careful planning. "I had promises to keep," Nathaniel replied, "and plans to prepare for." Margaret Sullivan waited on the front porch, her face beaming with maternal joy at Clara's return. The months of separation had only made the older woman's welcome warmer, and Clara found herself enveloped in fierce hugs and tearful exclamations about how much she had been missed. "Let me show you the changes," Nathaniel said after Margaret had finally released Clara from her enthusiastic greeting. The house tour revealed the extent of his preparations for their married life. A new wing had been added to accommodate a proper office where Clara could manage the ranch's expanding business correspondence. The kitchen had been enlarged to include a breakfast nook with windows overlooking the mountain views. Upstairs, the master bedroom had been redecorated with feminine touches that showed Nathaniel had been thinking carefully about Clara's comfort and preferences. "It's beautiful," Clara said, running her fingers along the carved headboard of the new bed. "But you didn't need to do all this for me." "I didn't do it for you," Nathaniel replied, moving closer. "I did it for us. This is our home now, Clara. I wanted it to reflect both our dreams." That evening, they sat on the expanded front porch, as the sun set behind the mountains, catching up on the months they had spent apart. Clara shared stories from the trial, her growing relationship with her mother, and her relief at finally seeing justice served. Nathaniel described the ranch improvements, the successful breeding program he had started, and the business connections he had made with cattlemen throughout the territory. "There's something else," Nathaniel said as the last light faded from the sky. "Something I've been working on that I wanted to show you in person." He led her to the barn, where he lit a lantern and guided her to a stall she didn't recognize. Inside stood a beautiful mare, chestnut with white markings, who nickered softly at their approach. "She's gorgeous," Clara breathed, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. "Where did she come from? I bred her specifically for you," Nathaniel said proudly. "Her mother was the gentlest mare in my herd, her father a stallion known for intelligence and sure footing. I wanted you to have a horse that would be a true partner, not just transportation." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "What's her name? That's for you to decide. She's yours completely." Clara studied the mare's intelligent dark eyes and graceful lines. "Hope," she said finally. "I'd like to call her Hope." "Perfect," Nathaniel agreed, his arm tightening around Clara's waist. "Absolutely perfect." The wedding took place in the meadow behind the ranch house, with the mountains providing a magnificent backdrop and the entire Millbrook community in attendance. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk that Margaret had sewn with loving care, her hair crowned with wildflowers that Nathaniel had picked that morning. Pastor Williams had traveled from Denver to perform the ceremony, and his words about partnership and mutual respect seemed particularly meaningful given everything Clara and Nathaniel had endured to reach this moment. Do you, Nathaniel Hayes, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, to honor and cherish in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying across the meadow with absolute conviction. Do you, Clara Whitmore, take Nathaniel Hayes to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, to honor and cherish in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Clara replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel's kiss was gentle but passionate, sealing promises that had been tested by separation and proven stronger than any obstacle. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Clara danced with her new husband under the stars, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends and friends who had become family. No regrets, Nathaniel murmured as they swayed to music played by a fiddle and guitar. Only one, Clara replied, her eyes sparkling with mischief. What's that? I regret waiting so long to find you. Nathaniel laughed, the sound rich and warm. In the mountain air. Worth the wait, though. Definitely worth the wait. Clara Hayes stood in the doorway of the ranch house, watching her husband work with a yearling colt in the corral. Their horse breeding program had become one of the most successful in the territory, with buyers traveling from as far as California to purchase Hayes-bred animals. The business expansion had required Clara's full partnership. She managed all correspondence, maintained detailed breeding records, and had even learned to assist with training the gentler animals. Her education and organizational skills had proven invaluable as the ranch grew from a simple cattle operation to a diversified agricultural business. "Mama, can I help Papa with the horses?" asked 4-year-old Sarah Hayes, tugging at Clara's skirt with determined hands. "When you're a little older, sweetheart," Clara replied, smoothing her daughter's dark hair. "Horses are big and strong. You need to be bigger and stronger before you can work with them safely." Sarah pouted prettily, but accepted the explanation. She had inherited her father's love of animals and her mother's stubborn determination, a combination that promised interesting challenges in the years ahead. 2-year-old Walter Hayes toddled over from where he had been playing with wooden blocks, his chubby hands reaching up to be held. Clara lifted him easily, settling him on her hip while continuing to watch Nathaniel's patient work with the young horse. The children had come as natural extensions of the partnership she and Nathaniel had built. They shared parenting duties, just as they shared everything else, with Nathaniel teaching practical skills while Clara handled formal education. Both children were already showing signs of the intelligence and independence their parents valued. "How's the new foal doing?" Clara called Nathaniel as he finished the training session. "Excellent temperament," he replied, approaching the fence where his family waited. "Should make someone a fine riding horse in a few years." "Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter is interested in learning to ride," Clara mentioned. "She's been asking about lessons." "Good. We can always use more young riders in the community." Nathaniel climbed over the fence and kissed Clara hello, then ruffled Sarah's hair and took Walter from Clara's arms. "How was your morning?" "Productive. I finished the correspondence with the buyer in Sacramento, updated the breeding records, and wrote to Mother about visiting this summer." Elizabeth Morrison had indeed begun visiting the ranch regularly, gradually rebuilding her relationship with Clara and developing a warm bond with her grandchildren. She had found peace in the simple rhythms of ranch life, so different from the social complexities of city living. "Any word from Marshal Cameron about the Theodore Blackwell investigation?" Nathaniel asked as they walked toward the house. Finally closed, Clara replied with satisfaction. He was sentenced to 15 years for fraud and conspiracy. The last of that criminal organization has been dismantled. Theodore Blackwell had eventually been captured in San Francisco, where he had been running confidence schemes on wealthy widows. His arrest had closed the final chapter on the criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed Clara's life. She felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, but relief that he could never again harm unsuspecting women with his lies. "Good," Nathaniel said simply. "Some chapters need to end completely before new ones can begin properly." As if summoned by his words, Margaret appeared from the kitchen, her hair now completely silver, but her energy undiminished. She had become an honorary grandmother to the Hayes children and showed no signs of retiring from her role as household manager. "Dinner's ready," she announced, then added with mock sternness, "and I expect everyone to wash their hands properly before sitting down to eat." Sarah giggled and ran toward the wash basin, while Walter clapped his hands at the promise of food. Clara and Nathaniel followed more slowly, their fingers intertwined as they had been since their wedding day. "Happy?" Nathaniel asked quietly, a question he had posed regularly throughout their marriage. "Completely," Clara replied, as she always did, every single day. As they gathered around the dinner table with their children and Margaret, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had stepped off the train at Millbrook Station 5 years ago had been broken, desperate, and afraid. The woman she had become was strong, confident, and surrounded by love built on truth rather than illusion. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if Theodore Blackwell had actually met her at the station as promised. Would she have married him and lived a life built on lies? Would she have ever discovered her own strength and capabilities? Would she have ever known the deep satisfaction of true partnership? But such speculation was pointless. Life had unfolded exactly as it was meant to, bringing her through abandonment and betrayal to love and belonging. The 3 days she had waited at Millbrook Station had been the most important days of her life, though she hadn't known it at the time. After dinner, Clara and Nathaniel sat on their porch, as they had every evening for 5 years, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become as familiar as old friends. The children played in the yard under Margaret's watchful eye, their laughter mixing with the evening songs of meadowlarks. "Do you ever think about her?" Nathaniel asked suddenly. "Who? The woman who stepped off that train 5 years ago, the one who was waiting for Theodore Blackwell?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. I feel sorry for her, actually. She had no idea what she was capable of, what kind of life was possible for her. She was brave, though, taking that train to Colorado, traveling alone to marry a man she'd never met." "She was desperate," Clara corrected gently. "There's a difference between bravery and having no other choice. Is there? Maybe real bravery is continuing to hope and try even when you have every reason to give up." Clara smiled at her husband's philosophical mood. In that case, she was very brave indeed, and very lucky. Lucky how? Lucky that the right cowboy happened to come down the right road at exactly the right moment. Nathaniel chuckled, pulling Clara closer against his side. "I think we were both lucky that night. I'd been waiting 30 years to find someone worth sharing this life with." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara felt the deep contentment that had become her constant companion. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her partner. The abandoned bride who had waited 3 days at Millbrook Station had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come, disguised as the worst disasters. The future stretched ahead of them, full of promise and possibility. Their children would grow up strong and confident, The ranch would continue to prosper, and their love would endure because it was built on the solid foundation of mutual respect, shared dreams, and absolute honesty. Clara Hayes had finally found her forever home, and it was everything she had never dared to dream possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.